Thank you. Well, thank you so much for the invitation to be here. This is an important conversation and a difficult one, so I am grateful to everybody here who's ready to dig into a serious matter such as this. So I think the first thing to say is it's important to bear in mind a distinction between freedom of speech and academic freedom. And I think many of our conversations in this area get into trouble because we lose sight of that distinction. So freedom of speech is connected to our First Amendment jurisprudence, of course, and is a feature of our public sphere, of our political life. That is, in our public sphere, we all have a right to express our opinion, as we also have a right to assemble and petition our government, and a variety of other privileges, rights rather, that are the purpose of which is to establish our political our voice, our political equality. In fact, one of the key concepts that I care about, freedom and equality, from my point of view, are mutually intertwining with one another. And there are places on college campuses that freedom of speech is also what is at stake, but that's a separate thing from academic freedom, which is rather the distinctive work of scholars of protecting free inquiry and maintaining standards in relationship to it. So that part of academic freedom is about evaluation and judging, considering arguments and making judgments about those which merit publication, for instance, merit dissemination. So in other words, whereas with regard to freedom of speech in the public sphere, we do want, in some sense, to maintain a view that anything goes. When it comes to academic freedom, the point of academic freedom is to enable a culture of judgment. Judgment, again, based on critical reasoning, on evidence, on fair argumentation and disputation. But it is reasonable within the space of the concept of academic freedom that people should judge some things, not things that we would teach or not things that we would publish. That is what the business of being a scholar is about. It's about making those critical distinctions. Now, I think on college campuses, again, the challenge is that these two concepts blur and get muddied in relationship to each other. And so, for example, in a classroom, we are working under the parameters of academic freedom, where indeed what we have to do is hard work of sorting out evidence around whatever subject is under discussion in the classroom. And it's reasonable within that context that in addition to the norm of academic freedom, we bring other norms to bear. Norms, for example, articulated by Socrates. So Socrates in ancient Athens, when he sought to pursue philosophical inquiry toward the truth, taking any inquiry as far as it might go, also made the case that genuine philosophy rested on a principle of love. Why? Because the truth makes life better for human beings. And so if you're committed to truth, you're also actually committed to loving the person with whom you are interacting. That is, in the Greek context, the concept of philia was one that should also govern philosophic discourse alongside the pursuit of the truth. And I do believe in our classrooms, if we're going to do right by the pursuit of truth, we simultaneously need to cultivate that free-ranging academic inquiry that focuses on evidence and argument and understands that the bounds should be broad, absolutely. People should begin the inquiry from whatever starting point they bring to the table, and we should take whatever starting point is there seriously. But then we should do the work of critique and assessment and judging and evaluation, and we should do that always with a norm of philia, a practice of friendship, well-intentioned orientation to the others in the room. And that is a second set of norms that run alongside academic freedom that should structure conversation and work on campuses, in my view.
Thank you,
Sure.
I want to echo Danielle's thanks to Ed and the Institute for making this conversation possible, conversation with Ed, with Danielle, with students and faculty here at St. Olaf. I want to say that the distinction that Danielle draws between academic freedom and free speech is very important. I'm going to talk about a slightly different distinction, and I hope it'll produce a lively conversation. I want to say something about the purpose of liberal education. It seems to me that the purpose of liberal education is to prepare students, young men and women, for the rights and responsibilities of freedom, and to do this by furnishing minds and by refining minds. To accomplish this, it seems to me, colleges and universities need to create an inclusive learning environment that fosters liberty of thought and discussion, unfettered inquiry and robust debate. However, it seems to me today, many students, faculty, and administrators think that there's a fundamental conflict between free speech on campus and diversity and inclusion. I think that's a mistake. I think that to think that there's a fundamental conflict as if it's a zero-sum game. One of more means less of the other. I think the mistake is based on a faulty understanding of free speech, a faulty understanding of diversity and inclusion, or faulty understanding of both. Occasionally I hear this lament. People will say, I get it, I understand what you mean. Freedom of speech is important. But really, what does freedom of speech have to offer to members of historically discriminated against minorities and to women? My answer is a lot, a tremendous amount. That's the short answer. The longer answer begins with 3 observations which some people might regard as provocations, forewarned. The first observation is that actually, in undergraduate education today in America, women are a majority. And what that means is that on most college campuses, I don't know the details of St. Olaf, but at most college campuses, if you add together women and members of historically discriminated against minorities, you get a numerical majority. And it's always been the tendency of numerical majorities to seek to characterize the opinions of the numerical minority as harmful and offensive and silence them. Second, I remind you, freedom of speech is a historical matter since it really arose in the West in the middle of the 17th century in Milton's attack on the licensing acts, John Milton's attack, has been on the side of persecuted minorities, dissidents, iconoclasts, and those advocating for social change. Censoring speech, regulating, policing it, censoring, has always been a favorite tool of authoritarians. Third observation. It seems to me that free speech is by its very nature inclusive. It offers to everyone, irrespective of race, class, or gender, the same marvelous benefits. The opportunity to express your views with all the arguments and evidence you can muster. It provides the opportunity, maybe better, to listen to a range of opinions. And related to the first two, it provides the opportunity on college campuses to live in a community, a special kind of small society devoted to inquiry and the pursuit of truth. Now, I agree with Danielle. Free speech in our system, it is, of course, it's a constitutional right protected by the First Amendment. Different places have different attitudes to broad latitude for speech. But here's the point. It seems to me we need to underscore the educational benefits of free speech. I know no better way to begin that exposition of the educational benefits. Actually, I know one better way, Danielle's way, Socrates. Second best way is John Stuart Mill. I remind you that in 1859, in a masterwork on liberty, chapter 2, Mill said regarding our opinions, there are really only 3 cases. Our opinions might be false, some pleasant case. Then we benefit from the regime of free speech because the likelihood is greater that we're going to encounter the right opinion. Second possibility, our opinion is true opinion. What do we need free speech for then? Because unless we encounter opposing opinions, unless we're involved in conversations with people who disagree, and disagree strongly, we'll come to hold our opinions, true that they might be, as prejudice, as dogma, as dead dogma. We'll forget their grounds, we'll forget their meaning, we'll forget their implications. But the third circumstance, says Mill, is the most common circumstance. Our opinions, it's hard also. Our opinions are partly true and partly false, and the other guy or the other woman's opinions, they're partly true and partly false. Freedom of speech helps us sort that out because it provides a range of opinions. My worry, and I come here not as an expert on St. Olaf, but looking around college and universities in the country, I worry that Mill's spirit, the spirit that says, he who knows only his side of the case knows little of that. I worry that that spirit is on the retreat. And again, I don't know the situation in St. Olaf, but in higher education in America, I worry that too many colleges are actually encouraging some students to think of themselves as weak, as wounded, as fragile, as frightened, and thereby encouraging an attitude of self-certainty and imperiousness in the expression of opinion. It seems to me it's an urgent task for our universities to encourage all students, from historically discriminated against minorities, women, and all the rest, to encourage our students, help form our students so that they're sure-footed in argument, strong, that they're curious and courageous in conversation, so that they're civil and tolerant in their expression. What might be done? For a start, wherever speech codes exist, they should be abolished. Universities should publish on their webpage strong statements endorsing freedom of speech and underscoring, not as a right, but underscoring its educational benefits. I think freshman orientation ought to incorporate seminars on the theory and practice of freedom of speech. It seems to me a good idea for universities as doing something like this. I don't see why more universities don't have an annual lecture on the theory and practice of freedom of speech. You could invite novelists, historians, legal scholars, political theorists, also activists to speak about freedom of speech. I think that universities as institutions should remain as neutral as possible on the great moral and political questions of the day. Why? So that they can create a framework in which those who live inside the universities, faculty and students and all others, can, in the freest way, debate the issues. In addition, we won't have freedom of speech unless we have students who are well educated for it. I would like to see a curriculum that featured prominently, preferably requiring, all students to take a course in the tradition of freedom that undergirds the American constitutional tradition and liberal education. I'd like to see all students, I'd like to see the curriculum offer and preferably require all students to take a course on the great moral, political, and religious questions, and it must be a course that features answers on both sides of the question. And finally, in the spirit of the Institute and the spirit of the evening, it seems to me even the most ringing praise of free speech on campus will ring hollow unless professors bring to the classroom the virtues of civility, tolerance, and serious engagement with the diversity of viewpoints. Thank you.
I think I heard a disagreement. At least a difference in emphasis in what the both of you said. Danielle, I heard, draw a fairly decided distinction between academic freedom issues and freedom of speech issues, and suggested that what goes on, for example, in the classroom under the rubric of academic freedom is also, in its ideal form, an expression of friendship. All right. I hear less a distinction being drawn by Peter, even though in principle you did make the point, between freedom of speech issues and academic freedom issues. When I think about the kinds of allowances in the larger society we hear about with respect to freedom of speech, it doesn't sound like friendship communities. That is to say, there are all sorts of things that are permitted, for example, by the First Amendment, perhaps with a kind of reluctance given certain values and principles. that one would not associate in with a friendship relationship or the kind of classroom relationship that Danielle has described. So I'm wondering whether either one of you might speak to that question. Is there a disagreement between you on this matter, at least in the way of emphasis?
Well, maybe I should start by fleshing out more of the concepts I laid out, and then I think you introduced this conversation by making the point that at a certain level of generality, there's broad agreement, and I think that's correct. I think that generality captures both of our positions, in fact, and I think that you're right that the challenge comes down to the specific cases and the specific work involved on a college campus of understanding the relationship between multiple sets of norms that are operating simultaneously, places where our mission is an educational one, fundamentally. So, for example, I agree with Peter on the notion that colleges and universities should avoid, as far as they can, taking positions on controversial political issues such that they can be spaces where people themselves are doing that work. But here's the place where these things perhaps come together a little bit. So though I think it's important to say that the right of freedom of speech and also the professional norm of academic freedom inside the academy, neither of those things brings with it a right not to have other people be offended by what you've articulated. Now, this is where the challenge comes in, and this is why I think that the norm of friendship that pertains in the classroom is important, because it's in relationship to the norm of friendship that we should be able to cultivate in an educational community that the problem of causing offense begins to matter. Now, to say that the problem of causing offense matters is not to say that one should always and forever avoid causing offense. But if one is about to anticipate speaking and knows that what one is going to say is likely to cause offense, one has two duties. One is the duty to the truth, to articulate it as clearly and as carefully as you are able to discern it, with humility in doing so, because as Peter said, most of us have a mixture of falsehood and truth in our views, so with humility also. But then you have a second responsibility, which is to the norm of friendship, to understand why exactly this may cause offense, and what are the things that you can do to mitigate, rectify, or repair that. In other words, I think a lot of our campus controversies emerge because we fail to understand a responsibility to enact trustworthiness in our conversations with others, precisely because we've taken our conception of the sort of freedom of speech too far, again, to think it means that we shouldn't care even about what kind of effect we have on others. And the problem with this is that it is simply the case that in our disagreements on hard issues, any one of us, depending on what the issue is, may have an experience of existential threat in relationship to a position that somebody else has, whether rightly or wrongly, all right? So we may be wrong to feel existentially threatened by a view that somebody has on, let's go through the sort of controversial lists, marriage equality, abortion, affirmative action, et cetera. But as it happens, many people on both sides of all those issues have an experience of existential threat when a view on the other side is articulated. We all know that going into a conversation. The argument I'm making is that with regard to the principle of friendship and reciprocity, we are actually responsible for assuaging that, even at the same time that we are doing our best to articulate the view that we have as clearly and as well in as well-reasoned a fashion as we can. That those two things go together. And now here's a place where Peter and I agree. So I apologize. I know some folks out there wanted us to get into a punching match with each other, which is unlikely to happen because we, in fact, like hard conversations, right? But the place where we agree is the importance of equipping students with the skills to have hard conversations. And so one very concrete thing is, for example, a set of educational resources that have been developed at a set of schools in Boston, where at a most basic level, they're teaching kids sentence starters. How do you start a sentence when you're about to tell somebody you disagree with them? Well, you don't start off by saying, I hate your guts and you're an idiot. To boot, right? You start off by saying, with all due respect. With all due respect. I have to disagree with this particular substantive point that you're making. And you avoid ad hominem. And there's a whole list of ways to start sentences to get into disagreement that in the first instance begin by affirming the principle of reciprocity and philia that I tried to articulate. And that's the sense in which these two norms can operate simultaneously. But I think it's on this issue of how we deal with the fact that there's no right for people not to be offended at one's views. That's where we get into the tricky territory.
Yes. So I concur in part and dissent in part. I agree with Danielle about the importance of philia or friendship in the most productive kinds of conversations. Danielle's a classicist, I'm not, so she knows better than I do. That nevertheless, Aristotle reminds us that we must put truth in front of friendship in inquiries. And moreover, if we think about Socrates, the man is offending just about everybody all the time. So seriously was the offense that he gave that he got himself put to death. So we face a drama.
But he told the Athenians they shouldn't put him to death. Right?
He told them they shouldn't put him to death, and then he explained they should instead reward him,
exactly.
even though he'd been
That's
convicted.
right.
He'd been convicted of not disbelieving in the gods of the city and corrupting the young. His reward should be being put up in the city hall and being given the greatest rewards as if he were an Olympic hero. That's generally not the best way to avoid punishment by asking for the maximal reward. It's almost as if you want to prove a point. But as I said, Danielle knows this stuff better than I do. So I'll restrict myself to the following. We can't always achieve friendship in our conversations. And even though I very much want our universities and schools, from kindergarten up, and families, to be teaching children, to be teaching students how to make arguments in the way best calculated to learn from other people. My fear is that as a practical matter in our universities today, we're giving as a practical matter, a kind of heckler's veto to those people who are offended. And often the problem really is not that a person begins a utterance with, you're wrong and here's why. It's because a substantive opinion is expressed, which is thought to be not just wrong, not just out of line, but as Danielle herself said, in regard to some of the most difficult social issues, an existential fear or an existential threat. In this sequence, I'll just make one final observation. We need to educate young men and women so as to help them overcome this existential fear. Look, if a man or woman signs up for flight school and says, I got an existential fear of flying, well, we're not going to start driving our airplanes on the ground to accommodate him or her. If someone wants to be a surgeon but says, I have an existential fear of blood, we cannot arrange the human body and operating theater so as to avoid the encounter with blood. Liberal education involves dealing with difficult issues. That's why I mentioned it involves the virtue of courage, the virtues of restraint, of civility and toleration. Those virtues are hard. We can't begin, and I take this as consistent with some of the articles Danielle's written, we can't begin too early inculcating these virtues so that our students don't come to us in college with existential fear of leading social and political issues.
So this is exactly where the issues come together, I think, is in the question of how to parse out responsibility around the experience of existential threat. So anyway, subtle difference between fear and threat, but anyway, we can ignore that one. So in other words, if we have two caricatured positions, okay, we've got we'll call them the snowflake position and the and the white supremacist position. Okay, I'm calling the charactered positions. Okay, so the snowflake position is that anybody who can't take being offended is a snowflake. And the problem is with their failure of virtue. They lack courage. They lack all the things that Peter just went through. And the caricatured white supremacist position is the problem when somebody gets offended is that the person doing the speaking has absolutely no concern for the harm they cause to others. Now, this is interesting, actually, because as it happens, those two positions constitute, conveniently enough, vices, both of them, on an Aristotelian framework of virtue, and you've introduced the concept of virtue. So let me just go through this really quickly, because I think it might actually be helpful. So Aristotle's theory of virtues is that every virtue is a mean of some kind. It hits a midpoint, and the conventional example is courage, all right? So courage is a midway point between rashness and cowardice. If you see a burning building and you rush in before you know if anybody's in there, that's just rash. That's not courageous. If you see a burning building and you know there's people inside and you do nothing about it, that's cowardly. So somehow hitting the middle point is a combination of knowledge and character. Now, in his list of virtues, Aristotle has one famous one called the unnamed virtue. He doesn't have a name for it. And he says it's a midpoint between being domineering, not caring what kind of harm you cause others, and being acquiescent, or just trying not to cause any harm whatsoever. That's sort of the other end of the spectrum. And the midpoint, he says, in between, is like friendship, but without the emotional factor. Okay? It's the habits of friendship. And those habits of friendship require something on the side of both parties in a speech exchange, the person who may be doing the offending and the person who may be offended. That is to say, yes, if in the face of arguments that are existentially threatening, we need to equip young people to address the substance, find resilience in relationship to the features of the argument that undermine their sense of having a place in the community, which happens without any question in some forms of argumentation. And similarly, for students who want to express views that they know will have this effect on others, they need not only courage, perhaps to break through the worry about offending, but also the graciousness of generosity to understand, to care about the harm they may cause, the damage they may do, and then to have the imagination to understand how to minimize that, to convey respect, to convey commitment to a place in the community for their interlocutor, an ongoing place, shared place in the community with their interlocutor. So I think that midpoint Aristotelian virtue is something that we're trying to get at here. In topics where offense may be caused, there are virtues on both sides that we have lost sight of.
Sure, there are, and in a well-constituted community of young men and women really devoted to the philosophical life, we could demand that the level of the virtues that you're speaking about, and I'm with you, I think, in that I would like to do everything within a university's power or a school's power to encourage the virtues on both sides. That is, there are virtues that speakers bring to a conversation, right? Bigotry, intolerance, name-calling, a determination to misrepresent the other person's argument, a desire to gratuitously shock. All of this undermines the educational experience, sure. And there are virtues of the listener, the ability to put yourself in another person's position, to help him or her imaginatively on your side fill out the argument that he or she is sketching. Sure, I agree. But as a practical matter, in today's classrooms, again, I don't know the situation in St. Olaf, but in too many places, what we're seeing is that a claim to be offended is invoked as a justification for shutting down speech. And as you all know, last fall we saw a number of problems on campus at Berkeley, at Middlebury, at Claremont McKenna. Just in the month of October, 5 consecutive working days, we had students shutting down speech at Columbia University, storming into a class being taught by Professor Susanna Goldberg, I think, professor of law, and actually a Title IX officer. The next day, the president at the University of Oregon, the president of the university's speech was shut down. On Monday of the next week, a Texas state representative had his speech shut down at Texas Southern University. Tommy Robinson at Columbia was shut down on the next day. Charles Murray back again at the University of Michigan on Wednesday. We have a problem, and we can speak about it in Aristotelian language. I fear that we've gone too far in one direction, and I'm delighted to agree with Danielle that people have no right, a speaker has no right to expect that his opinions will not offend others. People in college have no right not to be offended. We agree that gratuitous offense is contrary to the pursuit of education. The question is, what are the legitimate grounds for shutting down speech on campus? What kinds of violations? And as you can guess, my view is that much as we must encourage and teach civility and tolerance, a claim that a speech or opinion is offensive mustn't be used as a ground for shutting it down. And my reason is mainly historical. Whenever we have given authorities, government authorities, college authorities, religious authorities, the power to determine permissible speech and impermissible speech, that power has been used to label speech that the majority disagrees with as harmful or offensive. Sometimes it actually is, but the power is almost always abused. I'm very worried about its abuse.
So I just want to make clear to everybody that in those last points Peter was making were not addressed at me.
Correct.
But were addressed at a broader public conversation.
Correct.
Insofar as I have not articulated a view at all.
Correct.
I want to be just very explicit that campuses should shut down offensive speech. And in fact, I would agree with Peter that they should not. And I would also agree with Peter that practices of protest that are oriented towards silencing undermine the work that we need to do on college campuses of free inquiry, and also undermine the political work that we need to do of achieving negotiated settlements in relationship to hard issues. Negotiated settlements is the best democracies can do. Okay? Which is a hard thing for us all to get our heads around. It means we have competing positions. Parties' positions should be thought of as opening bids, and that's it. None of them are where we will end up. We work our way through a series of competitions, electorally, judicially, culturally, and we find negotiated settlements. And to do that work does require that those different opening bids have a chance to work their way through and be contested. And the contest has to have a set of norms around it that might be called fighting fair. And in some sense, that's what we're talking about here. And the only difference then between the political sphere and the college campus is that I think on a college campus, our aspirations should be loftier than merely fighting fair. And that is where I would come back to the view that on a college campus, our aspirations should be to achieve that political friendship I was trying to describe, where instead of achieving the bare minimum of the negotiated settlement that we work out in our political world, we might, talking about this earlier, achieve cultures of empathy that permit us to find solutions for how we build the world on our own campus that are richer in their content than the minimal threshold negotiated settlements that we get through our political process. But you can only achieve that if you are committed to to the virtues that should characterize interaction on both sides of a potentially offense-causing conversation. And for reasons that I don't understand, maybe you probably have a diagnosis, I don't know, but the relevant virtues have eroded everywhere on both sides. And so I think it's not, this is why I sometimes object to your formulations, is they tend to focus on one side of the error, when the error is really pretty comprehensive at this point. And I think we have a lot of work to do to rebuild our understanding of the kind of norms that structure competition through speech, fighting fair, or in the higher aspiration, maintaining academic freedom alongside a project of philia.
So I'll concur in part, dissent in part. Yes, of course, you're right, there's erosion on both sides, but it's also true that I think there's more dramatic erosion on one particular side. I affirm your account of that learning through conversation and dialectic that proceeds through the friendship that is grounded in the exercise of virtues. But here's the thing. I, in a way, feel about that in the way, here we can open up something more controversy. On the question of civic education, let's say in primary school or all K through 12, that is, when it comes to the colleges, if we had even modest success in negotiated solutions and say, okay, let's aim at rising above and ensuring that in our classrooms we achieve an exchange of opinion that's based on this compelling philosophical conception of conversation drawn from the classics. So in K through 12, our public schools are so often failing at providing basic literacy, competence in reading, writing, and in arithmetic. As soon as we get that right, which by the way I think is an essential component of your ability to participate in civic life, to vote responsibly, to maintain a job, and so on. So right now, again, I don't know the dilemmas and the accomplishments of life at St. Olaf, but we have a lot of evidence that throughout the country at universities, there is a strong inclination, at least among maybe among a small set of students, to shut things down. But I should take Danielle's point very seriously, which is the concern with opposing the shutting down of speech and all it represents should not for a moment be allowed to cause us, those of us who are concerned about these matters, to lose sight of the virtues that are exercised on the other side of the equation, the virtues that are exercised in presenting your views, taking into account where other people are coming from, framing them in such a way so that you can pull people in. That's a critical part of education. I agree 100%.
So, sorry, we've done it again.
So, yeah.
We've agreed again.